David, this is Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast, actual evolutionary psychology by actual evolutionary psychologists. Do you have anything else to say?
No, nailed it. We got it.
Boom. David, the law and evolution and psychology, the intersection of those three is what we talked about today.
That's right. It's a beautiful example of how anything involving human beings can be illuminated by evolutionary psychology. And law is a thing that is affected by human beings and human minds. And you would expect law to be illuminated by evolutionary psychology. And our guest today, Keelah Williams, who is a professor at Hamilton College and has both a PhD and JD,
Mm.
double threat, tells us all about law and evolutionary psychology.
Yeah, I love that we learned about sort of how jurors make decisions. We talked about the death penalty, attitudes about that. And then we even talked about Keel's work on ecology representations and how it drives a lot of stereotypes about even things like racial groups. Really important topics, really counterintuitive. And I think Keela is just a great example of really cutting edge empirical work in the evolutionary social sciences.
Yeah, and stay tuned for my tips on how to be a good criminal and Dave's hilarious rant about how everyone in the legal system is hungry, tired, and grumpy.
And I will put myself in that category too. Without further
Yes.
ado, grab a sandwich and listen, enjoy the episode. Yeah.
Yep.
David, do you want to introduce Keela?
Sure. Today we have Keelah Williams, who is a rare guest who has both a PhD and a JD. That is,
Mm.
she understands both the human mind and the human legal system. I'm kind of curious. I mean, given that we started there, how did you end up developing this combination of expertises, and what? How do you think one informs the other?
When I was an undergraduate, I worked in a research lab that was looking at jury decision making. And I, as part of that, was reading literature from attorneys who were talking about the strategies that they use sometimes to select members of the jury. And I was reading research from psychologists who were writing on a similar topic, and yet they were coming to opposite conclusions. And I thought that was really fascinating. And I wanted to develop expertise in both areas so that I could figure out what the truth was.
Hmm. And so is the goal for you to understand the mind of the juror, or is it more to understand the minds of the prosecutors or the judges? Whose minds are you most interested in getting inside?
I'm just generally interested in legal decision makers. So that
Okay.
involves jurors, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, all of the above, and lay people too, who are
Hmm.
asked to think about legal questions.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Do you feel, I mean, we can maybe like poke on and unpack some of those details because there's a lot to unpack. It's like what you're studying, but just as a starting point, once now that you've sort of wrapped your head around both views, should we feel pessimistic or optimistic about the legal system, or do you feel more pessimistic or optimistic, or is it sort of ambivalent? Like, is it worse than we think, or better, or what? What's your conclusion just based on being a scientist and seeing that the way that psychologists are talking and the way that legal people are talking, they're arriving at opposite conclusions. That sounds scary to me. Like if somebody did something to me that required the legal process, that level of inaccuracy, to put it away, is scary. Like you would want consistency. Um, but sometimes like psychologists are weird and like maybe the legal system has figured out a good system by just trial and error, even without science. Like, what's your take on that? Like, do you feel better or worse or what, yeah, what's up?
I often feel frustrated because the legal system is very, very slow to incorporate science in general and psychological science in particular. And sometimes they do eventually. I think and eyewitness memory research is a good example of this, where Elizabeth Loftus did, decades of work trying to show how unreliable eyewitness memory can be, and the courts have accepted that and incorporated it into some of their processes now. So that's a success story. But I think that there are other areas where junk science continues to permeate the courts, and that is a frustrating thing.
Mm.
Is it more that there's an ignorance of the psychological science, or is it that they're selecting the bad psychological science as opposed to the good psychological science, or is it a little bit of both?
It's probably a little bit of both, but it's ultimately a resistance to change, I think.
Hmm.
That there's a reliance in the law on we've always done it this way. And so that can be difficult to fight against sometimes.
Right. So it's
Right.
conservative institution, not in the political sense, but in the sort of like precise literal sense of like conservative, meaning like you kind of resistance to change, which can be a good thing if those changes lead to volatility that are sort of trial and error. That's sort of it sounds like it's conservative institution in that respect.
Yes.
Yeah.
That makes sense if there are certain stakeholders who might not win out from the new changes, or just by virtue of the fact that it's an institution that depends on people coordinating with one another. If you introduce new ideas and new procedures into it, it's going to make it harder for people to coordinate, and there are already a set of coordination points or Schelling points, as we might say, that have have rooted the whole institution, that everyone triangulates around these concepts of guilt, innocent mens rea, et cetera, et cetera. And to introduce new ideas is going to, tamper with something that's already working well in terms of coordination. Um, so we've already talked about psychology and the law. We haven't yet introduced the evolution piece. So how does the evolution piece fit in here?
So the goal of evolutionary psychology in particular is to understand human behavior, and the goal of law is to regulate it. And the better you understand behavior, the better you're going to be able to regulate it. So I see them as really, excellent bedfellows.
Interesting. Regulate. So it's not merely that the legal system wants to just boss us around arbitrarily, right? It doesn't want to just tell us what to do, as an end in itself. We might think or hope that it is regulating behavior in the service of some higher ideal, like justice, morality, or something like that. So I would then ask the question of, you know, to what end is this behavior regulation in pursuit of? We like to think or hope that it's in service of justice. Do you buy that idealistic story, or do you think something else is going on? What is justice?
You have 1 minute to define
Hmm.
justice.
Well,
Five words or less.
Yeah, exactly.
it's just funny. It reminds me of a story about someone who was just starting law school and was there on the first day, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and the law professor asked them to raise their hands if they were there to study justice. A bunch of them, like, here I am. And then the professor said, "Well, you're in the wrong place. The philosophy department is over there."
Mm.
So I I think it's a very cynical way of thinking about it, but I don't know that the law actually is designed in a way that promotes justice in particular.
Hmm.
So
Then what? Then how?
yeah, what
How?
is
Yeah.
it designed to do? Yeah.
Yeah. 5 words or less.
I know, right?
In
I
a
think
haiku format,
Yeah.
preferably.
Hmm.
That's good.
great, great. Um, I think it's designed to
Really hard question.
attempt to solve problems, but
Okay.
it doesn't do so in a highly efficient way. And it
Mm.
doesn't do so in a way that produces equal outcomes for
Mm.
individuals. So depending on your definition of justice, if that is what you want to see, then I don't think that the legal system is well designed to produce those outputs.
Right.
Hmm.
So it's sort of like we're all bumbling around. And like, there's a view of institutions which is sort of like we're all bumbling around and everyone is just like doing, everyone's busy and hungry and tired and sleepy and just doing the minimal thing to just kind of keep themselves going and like, keep their kids alive and, their family alive and stuff. And most institutions are sort of run by people just sort of doing the minimal thing reasonably enough. And so what you're saying is the justice system, if that's the word for it, or the legal system, is an institution because people had problems. It became other people's problem at some level, and so we had to come up with a mechanism to solve a set of problems. And it's sort of a good enough kludgy system that sort of has a way of sort of at least on the surface resolving problems, but it's nowhere near ideally designed or efficient. It's just this consequence of lots of hungry, sleepy, grumpy people sort of all doing something. Is that sort of a fair characterization of it?
Yeah, I really liked the terms that David was using earlier about it being a coordination problem. I
Mm,
think the legal system is really trying to coordinate behavior.
mm. And so, like in a criminal case or like a civil case, and kind of both, it seems like it's a lot about cost and cost redress. Is that a fair characterization, or how would you think about like what is the deep structure of what's the problem it's solving? Or maybe there's not a single thing. I don't know. Yeah.
You
It
guys are
see
not
it's
pitching the easy questions here.
I
no, I
know.
mean,
No, I just
well,
don't. We know so little. We're just
you know,
recapitulating like Law 101. We're like, we're just legal. At least for me, we're
what
just,
is the what are
yeah.
yeah.
What is the meaning of the law? Yes.
Uh, yeah, I mean, like, well, it seemed like the way you were talking about it, Dave, the problem being solved is a conflict between people. That these
Yeah.
people are in some sort of conflict, and they would prefer not to just endlessly kill each other and each other's family members, like Hatfields and McCoys.
Right.
And so, because that would be a problem for everyone else if that was happening all the time. And so these people's problems just become someone else's problems, and then they have to figure out how to keep them from not killing each other. And I love
Yeah.
your adjectives, Dave, of sleepy, grumpy,
Yeah.
hungry, tired, and these sleepy, hungry, grumpy, tired people are just like, all right, just doing the bare minimum to keep these people from killing each other.
Yeah.
And that's what the legal system is.
Yeah.
Is that a fair characterization, Keelah? Or
Yeah, I would say so.
oh wow,
Yeah.
okay,
Because
all
that's
right.
like that's also a set of selection pressures, right? I mean, like, is that like have I mean, like Keelah, like I know, like we had Deb Lieberman and we talked about the intersection of like law and evolutionary psychology. Like you've done probably you're one of the people, if not the person, who's sort of done the most in integrating those two. Has that point sort of you know that it sounds like that point you're making, right? Is that a fair characterization? That sort of the law, in some sense, does recapitulate what are and also selection pressures, like what David just described, is also something that like the our mental software design also had to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, one of the basic principles that I come from in my research is that these modern legal institutions are stemming from evolved psychological mechanisms.
Mm,
So how we're responding to these all related questions is being governed by the ways that natural and sexual selection have shaped our minds over
mm.
evolutionary time.
Yeah.
Um,
And one of the themes that like we've had on this podcast has been to sort of say that taking an evolutionary approach moves you out of naive realism, which is just sort of the idea that it's trivial to sort of process any part of the world. We know from evolutionary and cognitive science that there's a lot of mental software that's necessary to get anything, even like vision, off the ground. And the idea that sort of there's a lot of content rich, inference rich machinery a lot of which is social, a lot of which is strategic, which is also a theme of like David's worldview and themes. Um, that's a very different way of thinking about people, and that they're full of sort of motivated reasoning. And I would imagine that that really butts up against an idea that sort of jurors or judges or just legal scholars are just maybe, I mean, you can tell us like, is that the worldview of them? I guess there's an idea that people are sort of self-interested sometimes, but I mean, I even know like when I've seen like I've been on juries, like people will say like, oh yeah, just disregard what you just heard. And the idea that sort of like the little me in my head can sort of go in and like remove that information and all the consequences that information had in my mind is sort of it is very naive. So is that fair? Like that there's sort of like this very like almost cynical view of people from an evolutionary perspective butting up against a very sort of naive view of legal scholars, or again, is that like a cartoon where I'm being self-serving to my side?
No, I think that's a realistic description of um, the differences between how, as evolutionary scientists, we would think about the ways that people think and behave, and how legal scholars tend to approach it from uh, this, I would agree, a more naive perspective of how the mind works.
Yeah, and I think some of your work, I mean, like, do you have, are there certain examples like people might not know, like people who haven't read your work, like, are there examples, either in your work or other work that you're aware of that's sort of a good example of that, where sort of people have taken a naive view and then, oh, from an evolutionary perspective, we would expect this, and that sort of clarifies either legal issues or at least sort of we might have like a systematic way of saying like, look, people are going to be biased systematically this way or that way.
It's hard to pick one because I
No,
think
good.
that I got
We have a
a
lot of
lot of
time, so
my
yeah, yeah,
a lot of my research is looking at exactly that.
that's great.
So
Yeah.
this is probably a recency effect, but the one that immediately came to the mind is a paper I published last month that was looking at the influence of criminal motive on people's decision making. And
Mm,
so, um, from a very strictly legal sense, motive, the reason why somebody did what they did, um, is not supposed to matter when it comes to adjudicating guilt. That
Hmm.
whether or not you stole $20 because you needed to buy life-saving medicine or you stole $20 to buy illicit drugs,
mm.
it doesn't matter. You're guilty of theft all the same. And so the law really makes it clear that motive is not supposed to matter. But of
Interesting.
course,
Would it
yeah.
affect sentencing, or would it is it? I mean, maybe it does, in the real world, but is it supposed to be a
Yes.
consideration when it comes to sentencing?
Yes, at the
Okay,
sentencing phase, judges are explicitly allowed to use motive information
got
as
it.
both a mitigating and an aggravating factor for
Mm,
Mhm.
determining sentences. So it's a little bit different there. It's
mm.
more on the side of when you're deciding guilt. It's not
Hmm.
necessary for a prosecutor to prove motive, for example.
I
Um,
see. So just to make sure I'm keeping up with this, so intent matters. So like if you accidentally, so like if I went to a store and I accidentally put, like I had my son, for example. I don't think I've ever done this, but I could easily imagine, like, I have my son, I'm keeping an eye on him. There's a $20 item, and just by pure accident, walk out of the store versus I steal the $20 because it's life-saving medication versus I steal the $20 item because it's illicit drugs. The last two categories are intent, and the motive's different. And so
mhm.
the intent is what matters for guilt. Is that right?
Yes, so
Okay,
the intentionality of it, that's the mens rea, the
got
guilty
it.
mind
Okay,
component. And so
all right.
you do have to prove that the person intended to
Right.
commit the act.
So if I
Uh,
did it by accident, then it would be probably, hopefully, they would just sort of say, don't do that again. Right.
Well, I
right.
mean, maybe they could still convict you of something? I mean, because I know that you could, I mean, manslaughter is like unintended murder, and you can still, be convicted of manslaughter and have to go to prison for that, even though it wasn't your intention. If you
Mm.
just, you were reckless driving or something like that and you accidentally hit someone or whatever, you weren't intending to kill that person, but you ended up killing them. That could land you in a lot of legal trouble. Similarly with like medical malpractice, you end up, the doctor ends up, killing the patient by some accident or something like that. So even an accidental crime, you can still be guilty of that, right?
Yeah, so there are different levels of intentionality. There's
Mm-hmm.
knowingly, purposefully, recklessly, negligently.
Mm-hmm.
And so different levels of the extent of intent that you
So
have.
is there a difference between recklessly and negligently?
Yes, there is a difference
Whoa.
between them. Yeah.
Could you enlighten us on what the difference is there? Because they seem indistinguishable to me.
Yes, so reckless, if you're asking me to recall my intro
The
criminal law
bar,
class.
anybody who's
So
like studying for the bar, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I know it's
This will be helpful for me when I'm planning
Yeah,
my life of crime so that I can,
exactly. Yes,
carefully contort my behavior
exactly.
so that it fits the behavior with the lower sentence. So
Yeah.
yes, tell us what the difference is and what the lower sentence is.
so again, I'm pulling this back from the absolute recesses of my mind. This should
Mm.
probably
Hmm.
be fact checked
Okay.
before it gets
We'll run it
accepted.
by ChatGPT. Don't worry.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's a difference between if you should have known that what you were
Hmm.
doing was wrong versus you
Mm,
knew and ignored what you were doing was wrong.
right.
Um,
Hmm.
so
I
to
could have.
be,
Yeah. So,
go
like,
ahead.
if David is building a bridge and he's like using shoddy bolts and it's going to fail, and he knows he's doing that, versus he's just incompetent because it's his first day on the job. One is reckless because he's just like, yeah, this bridge is going to fail. I don't care. It looks fine. And then the other one is he's just incompetent. Sorry, David, but um, and so that would be negligent. Is
I
that the
think so.
distinction? Okay.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm starting. I mean, this is a really psychologically subtle distinction.
Yeah. It's very
That
psychological too. Like it's
yeah,
based on
extremely.
yeah, yeah. But
Um,
we're digressing from the our looping back here to the example of evolutionary principle. So this is about the motive of the effect of motive on the criminal. And so we've established, right, that that intent matters for guilt, but that and motive shouldn't, according to the law. Whereas motive should matter for the strength of sentencing. And
Mhm.
David has some information about how to start his life of crime or at least shoddy bridge building uh,
mhm. Maybe
career.
that's a reason for strategic ignorance. For
Nice.
maybe I
Exactly.
don't want to read the actual instructions on how to build a
Exactly.
good bridge because then I'll be more likely to be convicted of recklessness as opposed to mere negligence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're I think we are bumbling our way. David and I are bumbling our way into a life of crime here. So can you keep us up to speed now? So I think we've got the intent or the motive shouldn't matter for guilt.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that's where we're at so far.
Yeah. Okay. So why doesn't the motive matter for guilt?
That's just what the law has determined,
Mm,
that
Hmm.
the reason behind why you're doing the illegal thing doesn't matter in terms of deciding whether or not you have done it with the requisite intent. And so it's supposedly irrelevant. That doesn't mean that it's impermissible to talk about motive,
mm,
and prosecutors definitely do, which was one of the reasons why my collaborators and I were interested in this paper, is because why is it that this thing that the law considers so irrelevant is nonetheless really heavily emphasized in a trial, um, to help to, craft a narrative of what the individual did and to make an adjudication of guilt more likely. So we had looked at what previous literature had said, other psychologists have said about motive, and found that their conclusions were really unsatisfying. It was essentially like, we care about motive because we want to punish bad people, and we want to punish bad people because we have this inherent desire to punish
Punish
people
bad
who we
people.
think are bad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Well,
classic circular psychology reasoning right
so
there.
you take the Y and X and you transpose their order, and then you okay,
Hmm.
got it. I'm figuring out how to be a old school
This is
theory crisis.
non-evolutionary psychology 101.
This
We're
is
teaching
how
you.
this is how to do the theory crisis 101. Okay, great. Got it. So good. I got X and Y, and now I'm going to change the order to Y and X. And the first is okay, got it. Okay, I'm up to speed. Great. We're learning how to be criminals and bad psychologists. Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, so we found that explanation pretty unsatisfying. And
Mhm.
so we wanted to take an adaptationist approach to thinking about why would motive be so impactful. And what we suggested one reason is might be because motive matters for assessing association value. So whether or not this is a person we want to keep in the future as a cooperation partner. So motive is feeding into this calculation of association value, and we propose that the reason why it's doing that, or the mechanism through which it's doing that, in part is by affecting our calculation of the welfare trade-off ratio
Mm.
Mhm.
that
Did
we
we
think
talk,
that other people have. Go
David, did
ahead.
we talk about welfare trade-off
We
ratios? We
might
talked
have
about
briefly.
anger.
We talked about. I think we talked about it briefly in the context of anger, but
But
we
I don't
haven't really
know.
delved
Yeah.
into it that fully.
Yeah.
So
So could you
maybe
unpack that? Yeah.
yeah.
Sorry
So
to
what? Yeah,
interrupt.
what is a welfare trade-off ratio?
So essentially, and feel free to jump in
Hmm.
and adjust my explanation at any point, but you can take somebody's welfare into account a little bit, not at all, a whole lot. And you can also figure out switch points between when people start taking their own welfare more into account than when they take other people's welfare into account. And this information is really useful because the extent to which someone takes your welfare into account is predictive of really important information, like, for example, if they're going to exploit you or not.
Hmm.
Is there anything else that you want to add to?
I
No,
mean,
that's great.
we
Yeah.
sort of intuitively talk about welfare trade-off ratios as like how much someone cares about you.
Mhm.
Whether they really value or care about you. If they don't give a shit about you, then they would have a low welfare trade-off ratio. It's basically an attempt to turn this intuition about, caringness into like hard math, where like they're willing to impose a cost of $10 on you to gain a measly $1 for themselves. That's a really low welfare trade-off ratio. But if they're willing to impose a cost of $10 on you to save themselves $10, then maybe it's more understandable, more forgivable. And if they're imposing a cost of $10 on you to save $20 for themselves, then it's like, okay, maybe I would have done that if I was in their shoes, and I can understand that. And so it's an attempt to take this intuitive notion of how much a person cares about us or values us and translating it to something hard and numerical that we can study empirically and then we could think about in adaptationist terms, where surrounding yourself with people who have high welfare trade-off ratios toward yourself would have been a strong selection pressure, and the ability to negotiate and recalibrate other people's welfare trade-off ratios would have also been a strong selection pressure, and that led to the evolution of emotions like anger, for trying to recalibrate other people's welfare trade-off ratios, guilt for recalibrating your own welfare trade-off ratio if it was too low, et cetera, et cetera. Um, okay, so we care about motive because it reflects or it is indicative of the perpetrator's welfare trade-off ratio, and we care about that because that tells us something very important about the underlying character of the perpetrator and whether we want to associate with them.
Exactly. And there's a really great example that Aaron Sell has used, talking about, did somebody ruin your sweater because they needed to wipe their mouth? Or did they
Hmm.
ruin the sweater because they needed to staunch their child's bleeding wound?
Hmm.
And so the crime of the ruined sweater is exactly the same. But
Right.
the
Hmm.
motive behind why they did it tells you something about how much they care about you and your
Mm.
welfare, and thus what their behavior is likely to be in the future.
Mm. And so,
Hmm.
from a legal perspective, what does the law say about welfare trade-off ratios, or what does the law say about a juror caring about how much the defendant is going to value them?
That you should not care about
Ah,
that thing. And in
right.
fact, they set up some rules so that they don't have people who are invested in particular outcomes serving as jurors.
Mm.
Right, like if your brother is on trial, you're not allowed
Right.
to be a juror in that case
Maybe unless you
because
hate your brother. Well, you can't hate your brother or really like your brother. You have to be completely
right,
indifferent.
Hmm.
exactly.
So I kind of want to clarify. So we're not talking about the presence or absence of a motive. We're talking about the presence of one motive versus the presence of a different motive. Because I might expect that the presence or absence of a motive might be a crucial piece of evidence in a criminal proceeding. If I'm trying to argue that the defendant is guilty and he has a plausible motive for doing the crime, that's going to count as evidence that he is guilty of the crime. If he has no motive, no reason to have committed the crime, that will count
Mm.
as evidence against the idea that he's guilty. So you're not talking about that, right? Because that presumably would matter in assessing a defendant's guilt.
So I am not talking about that, but
Okay.
I also would say that that does not need to be a component.
Mm.
Like prosecutors could say nothing about motive and still provide the evidence that the person is guilty. You
That's
So
true.
don't
it's not
need to prove
necessary.
It's
someone's
not
It's not
right.
necessary.
It's not
yeah,
necessary,
yeah,
but it's certainly
yeah,
impactful, and that's why
yeah,
prosecutors use it.
yeah.
I will say, though, since what you just said reminded me of this, that the absence of a motive also has implications for WTRs. Like,
Hmm.
if you
Interesting.
just killed the fourth person that walked by you on the street, that implies something about
Mm.
your how much you care about other people's welfare relative to your own
Hmm.
and what kind of
Yeah,
threats you're likely to pose in the future. So sometimes the absence of motive conveys
Mm.
important
that's
information
interesting.
too.
I see.
In that case, it would point in two opposite directions. So if I have less of a motive or less of a plausible motive, it would make it less likely that I did the thing at all. But if I did do the thing, it would make me a much worse person and give me a much worse sentence. So the lack of a motive leads to both less likelihood of guilt, but if guilty, a more severe sentence.
Potentially, yes.
So,
Interesting.
David, more severe because you did the random thing versus if you knew the person?
More severe because if I killed the person capriciously or
Yeah,
arbitrarily, that would have very low benefit to myself
yeah,
and thus convey a much lower welfare trade-off ratio than if I killed someone, say, out of self-defense or
yeah.
something like that. Yeah.
No, exactly. But I think this is, I mean, and yeah, and Keelah, you can unpack this for us much better than me bumbling. But like, what I like about an evolutionary approach is that it unpacks that and gives it a causal why, right? So like,
Mhm.
I think we all have the intuition that if it was, if somebody, as in Keelah's example, was like, oh yeah, I'm going to count up to the fourth person, I'm just going to kill that person, versus like, oh man, like somebody killed somebody because like some interaction they had, they still killed the person, but the intuition is like the counting to four person is way worse, right? Um, and I think an evolutionary approach gives you, well, one of the benefits is that it gives you an explanation for why that is, like David said, right? And it also, I mean, Keelah, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but like it also relates back to what you're talking about, which is if I'm a juror, I'm evaluating from an evolved perspective, like I'm designed to care about myself and like my interests. And so if I'm sitting in the jury box and I hear a story about somebody who killed somebody because that person wronged them, I'm thinking, well, did I wrong that person? No. So, and how likely is it I would wrong them versus could I walk past them? Right. And that's very likely. And so it's much more likely that the person who counts to four and kills somebody is going to hurt me or my family than the person who had a very like specific interaction that me and my family didn't have. So from an
Mhm.
evolutionary perspective, it makes total sense that I would really dislike the counting to four person much more than the interaction person. And that's another, I mean, that would be another example of the evolutionary logic being very powerful
Mhm.
in offering an explanation for why those very different scenarios feel so different.
Yeah, in our paper, we use exactly the example of we are going to be less upset by the person who kills their boss because their boss didn't give them a raise rather than the person who kills the fourth random person who walks by them on the street.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, scary.
Mm.
So you did, how
Number
did you do?
four strikes
Yeah,
again.
exactly. Yeah. Don't be four. How did you, yeah, you should just like make sure you have a,
Is
that
this
would
going to be in
be
your screenplay, number four?
exactly. And then you just make sure you have like four people in front of you all the time. And then you just like have a backup. So you could game this as a strategy. This is a very good screenplay, David.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through like how do you actually do that study? Like, do you get participants to think they're imagine they're jurors, or like what are the like what on the ground like what kind of studies do you do to actually assess this?
So the paper that we published was purely theoretical.
Mm,
It was
that's the
not an
best.
empirical.
That's great. You're talking to two, yeah,
Yes, it was just us pontificating.
yeah. That's great.
Um, so, but
Not just, not just, yeah.
we did say that you'd need empirical research to flesh out the ideas that we were proposing. But I think that there are a couple implications that lend themselves really nicely to empirical tests. So one of them is this idea that we can find perpetrators with different motives being similarly responsible for an offense, but reach very different conclusions about their W2Rs. And
Mm,
that should then predict how much we want to punish them. That the ratio of cost to benefits to the parties matters to people who are observing these actions. So if there's an action that produces a great benefit to a perpetrator, like the more acceptable the motive is perceived to be, then that's going to be better than if you have a motive that is not providing great benefit to the actor.
mhm.
So that I think could be easily tested. Also, if the future behavior of this offender is anticipated to in some way be benefit enhancing, then that even a bad motive will result in less punishment compared to an offender who's going to be seen as imposing future costs. And then
Mm.
related to that, if their future association value is high, then their motive is going to be less influential in general on your desire to punish them. And so
Oh,
I think all of those are quite testable questions.
yeah, those last two seem really important. Can you give examples of those? Because those are like really subtle, kind of complicated ideas.
So if you have some situation in which you think that the person is going to benefit you in the future. So for example,
Like a famous person. Like let's imagine I'm a juror and the
yeah,
person like is
or like a doctor,
mm,
a top surgeon,
I see.
right, who
Yeah,
specializes in difficult to treat cancer cases
right.
or something,
Okay, got it.
versus a homeless person off the
Mm,
street,
right.
Mm.
that
Okay.
their motive, even if the doctor has a worse motive than the homeless person,
Mm,
you might still see people less willing to punish the doctor harshly.
Mm. And this
right.
might, and this is something where like character might come in. So if there are a lot of people who testify that the doctor's a wonderful father, a wonderful doctor who's helped a lot of people, he has really
Mm,
great character, that might affect the juror's opinion, affect sentencing. Even if, his motive was really bad in this case, we might still view his association value as high if in general he's a really good guy.
it's like the
Interesting.
interpersonal legal version of like the bank's too big to fail, right? It's sort of like too valuable to convict.
So you mentioned that motive is irrelevant for assessing guilt, but it is relevant for assessing the severity of the sentencing. given your knowledge of how the human mind works with regard to evaluating motives, do you think that is the right way to set up the legal system? Is it good to separate out whether when the motive matters in terms of which part of the procedure, or do you view this as a wrong-headed way of approaching the justice system?
I think that it's a little bit naive to think that motive is irrelevant for adjudicating guilt. I think it is good that judges are legally permitted to use motive because they would do it anyway.
So my intuition is that it's a good thing. Let me see if I can run this argument by you. Because when you're thinking about whether the person did it versus how badly they should be punished if they did do it, these are two very different questions. The first question is just about trying to figure out what's true, just trying to figure out the facts of whether they actually did the thing. And then the second question is, okay, given that they did the thing, how bad of a person are they, and how bad of a punishment do they deserve? And it seems like you wouldn't want facts from the second part to contaminate parts from the first part. Like in the first part, you just really want to have a clear-headed view of whether they actually did the thing and what the evidence is. And if you're biased in answering that question by your hatred of the person, that's going to give you a less reliable answer to the question of whether they actually did do the thing, right? And so it seems like it might actually be smart to separate those two questions and say, first, we just want to figure out what the facts are, what actually happened, what the person did, whether they did it intentionally or by accident. Let's figure out what happened. And then once we figured out what happened, then we can start to get into, the person's character and how badly they deserve to be punished. Does that argument make sense to you, or do you disagree?
It makes sense, but I think it's unrealistic to believe
Hmm.
that it's not going to matter in that first half. It reminds
Mhm.
me a little bit of this is sort of tangential, but another thing in the justice system that has always boggled my mind, that jurors are not allowed to be told what will happen to individuals who are found not guilty by reason of insanity.
Hmm.
And
What?
they tend to assume that the person will just walk free, when actually what happens is they often are institutionalized. Um, and
Not guilty. So you mean, hmm. So wouldn't
That's
it be
so weird.
guilty, but so interesting. So they're found guilty of the crime, but they're judged to have committed it because of a mental illness,
yes,
and in
so
that
so
case,
they're
they're not allowed.
technically not guilty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. I
David,
didn't
I
know that.
think maybe let me poke on David's
Yeah,
assumption here. And
yeah.
Keelah, you can tell me if I'm wrong. David, I think you are giving the legal system maybe too much credit, or
Hmm.
it's more of a like a flow chart. So a guilt is an operational definition. It just has like sort of if you're guilty,
Yeah.
this happens.
Right.
So like it's not as if like I mean, for example, if you're guilty, there might be a minimum sentence that's already imposed by
Hmm.
definition.
I
So
see.
this might be a place where, it's not like I have the discretion as a judge to just do whatever based on an objective view of they did it or not. My hands might be tied. So I might actually say not guilty because I want to avoid the minimal sentence. Is that true, Keelah, or am I completely making that up?
I guess I'm not following.
So I think David is correctly, if we were going to start from scratch and do the Pinsoff Williams Pietraszewski legal school of thought, is basically saying like, look, there's just facts on the ground. Like, did somebody do it or not? And we should just not imbue that. We should not contaminate that with value judgments. So we should just establish whether or not it happened, and then after that, figure out what makes sense and is rational to do. And I completely agree with that. But what I'm saying is the definition of guilty or not guilty comes with it automatically certain built-in consequences such that it's not really possible to do what David's saying in some cases of just sort of like let the facts be the facts, and then we have full flexibility in choosing how we value what happened, right? So in other words, just to make it concrete, like let's say somebody, it's a horrible example. Let's say like somebody's family is like killed by somebody, and the person who's left like seeks revenge on that person, right? And let's say that happens in a state where there's just like a minimum sentence for somebody who commits murder. The jury or the prosecutor or the judge might just decide, look, this was such a heinous crime that the person was revenging that we don't want them to be punished at all. So we're just going to declare them not guilty, even though technically, it would be better if we could just say, well, they are guilty, but there's such exonerating circumstances. We're just not going to punish them at all. But maybe that's just not an option in that state, for example. That's what I'm
There's,
saying.
I see. There's a term for that. It's
Hmm.
called jury nullification when it's
Ah,
juries who are doing it.
okay.
That if they say, yes, we've come to the conclusion that the person did it, but for reasons X, Y, and Z, we don't want to say guilty. We're going to say not guilty.
I see. So that would be
Mm.
an
That's jury
example
nullification.
of the value, the hands being tied sort of consequences of the assessment actually goes back and changes the assessment, which I think is a smart. I mean, given the institutional constraints, that's not an unreasonable thing. I mean, I imagine it's abused too, right? Like in your example, like we don't want the surgeon to go to jail, so we're going to change the conviction or something.
Right.
That's interesting. Yeah, it seems to me intuitively like that's a badly designed system, like that you'd want to separate those two
Hmm.
questions. Like we'd first want to establish that the guy did avenge his family's death and did kill the person. And then once we know that, if we decide that, it was such a heinous act that he was avenging, he doesn't deserve to be punished, then that's fine. So we'd say in that case, he's guilty, but his punishment is zero because he was justified. That to me makes much more sense than like blending the two questions together in the way that the legal system currently works. Uh, do you agree with that, Keelah, or do you think it's good to blend them?
Well, I think the legal system is trying to keep them separate.
Got
Hmm.
it.
That it's human psychology that's blending them in
Hmm.
these
Okay.
ways. Yeah.
Hmm.
Hmm.
So it's like a
Yeah.
Interesting.
dynamic, right? So sort of like, so like if I'm a politician, I'm like, anybody who kills somebody, we should have a minimum sentence because we don't want to let murderers go free. And everyone's like, that's great. And so I impose that structure without thinking through the consequences. And then the person who's avenging, their whole family's death has this issue. So that would be an example, right? Of like, we create an institution that sort of fights against the realities that the politician wasn't thinking about, for example.
That's interesting. Um, so given that we don't take the motive into account when we're evaluating guilt, um, there's this interesting question of, when a jury is hearing this case, we know from our psychologist's perspective that the jury is going to be evaluating the prospective benefits that the perpetrator might heap onto the juror and the prospective costs that the perpetrator might inflict onto the juror. And that is going to weigh their decision making to a quite substantial degree. And so do you also think this type of reasoning has implications for juror selection and impartiality of, which jurors are likely to have an impartial perspective on the crime? Um, what do you think about that question?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question that it certainly seems to be the case that and I think the law does recognize this and does its best to try to remove the partiality, the partial jurors from being able to sit on cases. But it would be interesting to think about, I think, more deeply what are the kinds of cues that offenders are going to give off that jurors might lead jurors to be less impartial.
Right.
Hmm.
Like if you're, I mean, just thinking it concretely, like if you're a family member of a homeless person,
Mhm.
like that's a really terrible thing if like the fact that somebody on the juror thinks that, my uncle is gross and wouldn't want to be around them, which has zero bearing on whether or not they did something, has zero bearing on like what is objectively right to do legally. But the simple fact that like, my poor uncle is gross to this person who's sitting in the jury box is going to have an effect on their psychology. That seems important to know. And like it's in like this is happening now, right? Like this, the idea, at least the idea in theory, and presumably it plays out. And I think there's probably lots of cases where this idea of association value affecting these decisions, that seems really important. Is this known at all, like in the legal community?
So I think that they tend to rely really heavily on intuition.
Mm,
Uh, Attorneys, especially in the context of jury selection, that individual attorneys will have really arbitrary things that they think matter. Like, to give a concrete example, I knew of one attorney who always looked at the socks that prospective jurors were wearing because he felt like he could determine personality characteristics from what their
mm,
socks were like.
right.
And there was another attorney who would always ask if you were at the airport. So we would ask prospective jurors, if you were at the airport and you had to buy a magazine at the book stand, what magazine would you pick? And then would use that to try to infer something
Mm,
useful about which jurors they should select. And so it's it's not a very scientifically informed process, I would say,
Hmm.
um, for the
I
most
mean,
part.
if we were designing the Keelah Williams approved legal system, would you have every prospective juror fill out a prospective welfare trade-off ratio questionnaire with regard to the perpetrator toward themselves, and then look at the average welfare trade-off prospective welfare trade-off ratio and exclude jurors with whose scores were, say more than a standard deviation away from the mean or something like that?
That would certainly be an interesting approach.
I mean, because that it
a very
seems to be
legal,
what.
a very lawyery response. Very legal. He
I mean,
was very
obviously that's
careful.
a terrible idea because it could be gamed, but
Yeah, exactly.
but that seems to be what lawyers are intuitively trying to do. Like, if say a black person was murdered, and they're going to look at the race of each prospective jury member to see if they're going to be an impartial juror for the crime. If it was racially motivated, that's going to depending on people's racial views, that's going to potentially influence their decision. So presumably that happens a lot in legal proceedings if it was related to religion or sexual orientation or and basically any detail of the crime is going to be relevant for excluding jurors who might have a stake in the outcome or who might be biased in one way or the other. And lawyers have an intuitive sense of what's going to affect a person's level of impartiality. So presumably they're already doing something like this intuitively, but this would just be putting it in more concrete terms.
Mhm. I'm curious, have either of you been called for jury duty or served as a juror?
I have been, but I've gotten out of it, or maybe I was kicked out. Either way, there's been only one or two times where I wanted to because I had the time, and even then I wasn't allowed. Typically, it's just like I'm an experimental psychologist, and sort of that excludes me. But there's been times both whether or not I want to, I've never been allowed to be on a jury.
What
Yeah,
about
I've
you,
been.
David?
No, I've never served on a jury. I came close once, but I didn't want to, and I found a way to get out of it. So like so the like there was the trial was going to be like when a friend was coming to visit me, and I would have had to like miss him coming to visit, and so I wanted to get out of it, and so what I did was I didn't lie. I gave
We'll
honest
edit this
information
out.
about my
We'll edit
background.
this out.
We can
Yeah.
edit this out. So, I mentioned I was a PhD psychologist, and I said I was skeptical of eyewitness testimony because I have read all the literature from Elizabeth Loftus that eyewitness testimony is unreliable, and the case involved eyewitness testimony. And I said that maybe a little bit more forcefully than I otherwise would have, just to hopefully scare the lawyer away, and it worked. And the prosecutor did not want me as a juror for that reason, and so that was a successful strategy for getting out of it. So yeah, that's a pointer for anyone else who's listening who wants to try to get out of jury duty. Um, So we got recommendations for, committing crimes, for getting out of
Yes,
jury duty, for
exactly.
writing bad screenplays about
Yeah.
the number four killer. We got a lot
Why,
of,
why, why else would you, why else would you either learn about the law or listen to a podcast?
I know this is just a treasure trove of insights for our listeners.
You
Anyway,
have to
where
have
was I going with that?
affordances, right? Affordances, right? That's one of
Yeah.
the, because Keelah, you came out of the ASU School of Evolutionary. Can you talk like just as we do tangents all the time. You're from the ASU school, is that right? Arizona State?
Yes.
Yeah. And your advisors were,
Steve Newberg in the psych department and Michael Sachs in the law school.
oh, fantastic. Cool. And what is their thing is sort of affordances, is that right?
Yeah, so affordance management theory, the idea that the goal of the social mind is to identify threats and opportunities in our environment and to respond to them in opportunity enhancing and threat mitigating ways. Yeah.
Mm. And
What a crazy idea. I
yeah,
cannot believe
exactly.
how could it just makes no sense at all to me that we
Yeah.
would have evolved to avoid threats and pursue benefits. I mean, what a crazy way of thinking.
It must sound stilted to people who are unaware of the history of the behavioral sciences or the legal sciences, right? To sort of say that because it's sort of like, well, duh. But then exactly, Keelah, as you're saying, like it sounds like what you are doing is exactly in a lovely example of applying that really important idea to a really important area where it hasn't been done before, which is just to say, look, jurors are assessing affordances in a way that's completely independent from what the letter of the law is.
Mhm. And one of my primary research areas has been about understanding people's attitudes towards the death penalty. And that
Mm.
is a really interesting area to think about applying affordances to.
So
Hmm.
tell us more about that.
So I worked on a project with Ashley Votruba and our advisors, and it was looking at how resource scarcity influences people's attitudes towards the death penalty and their willingness to impose death on offenders.
Wow.
And uh, it was really an interesting project because so much of the death penalty attitudes literature and psychology has focused on really proximate explanations. So, for example, political ideology, that conservatives are more likely to endorse the death penalty than liberals are, um,
Hmm.
which, has a lot of research to support it. I'm not um, bagging on that work by any means, but there weren't really any approaches looking at more ultimate explanations. And so we started from the premise of when you are faced with a serious offender in your group, you have to make an important decision about whether or not you're going to try to rehabilitate them or if you are going to eliminate them, whether that's like banishment from the group or actually killing them,
Mm.
whichever. You either need to decide if you're going to get rid of them or you're going to try to incorporate them back into the group. And what we suggested was that the amount of available resources in the environment is going to affect that calculus. That if you have plentiful resources, then you're going to be more willing to take a chance on rehabilitating the person. And if your resources are scarce, you're going to be less willing to risk repeated offending. And so you're going to be more likely to get rid of the person. And we
Hmm.
found some evidence to support that, both archivally across the globe in the United States, and then experimentally as well in the lab. So that was a really fun project.
Well, how do you assess or manipulate resources, or what is meant by resources?
So what we did for our lab studies was we gave people a slideshow about the economy, and
Mm.
it either suggested that the economy was doing great and was in an upswing and there are all these available jobs and everything is fantastic, or it said that the economy is in the shitter and is just getting worse and there are no jobs and so forth. And at the time that we ran that study, it was shortly after the Great Recession. So it was actually pretty believable that the economy could be either good or bad at
Mm.
that time.
Hmm.
And then after they read the economy information, then they answered questions about um, their attitudes toward the death penalty. So, did they think that the death penalty is necessary? Do they think that it should occur faster? Those sorts of things.
Mm. So just let me flesh this out and you can tell me if it's right or wrong, but at different scales, so of sort of a time sampling, there's sort of software in my mind for detecting resource availability. So like, you know, do are things, it's intuitive, right? Like are things nice, well kept up? There's enough stuff for me, for my family, whatever. And then or like it's just desperate. I see lots of desperation. There's just not enough stuff. And then if you encounter somebody like a criminal, there's just this issue of like, and it's going to take resources to rehabilitate them. This idea that's sort of like, well, it's gonna be cheaper and quicker to just kill them. I mean, this is like very blunt, but it's like the psychology is sort of like it's gonna be cheaper and quicker to just kill them as opposed to like invest all this time and energy and money in. Is that fair?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah. Now, is that accurate in any way? Like, even assuming that people can accurately assess resources, like, is that even true? That like imprisoning people is very expensive. I think killing people is even more expensive, let alone the morality of it. Like this seems like a very like mismatchy kind of thing. Let alone like letting people decide who should die because of like ambient, feelings about scarcity.
So it is true that killing someone in America with the death penalty is more expensive than keeping them alive for life.
Mm,
And that is because of all of the mandatory appeals processes that we have.
mm,
If it were the case that the person would be found guilty and sentenced to death and then taken out back and shot, it would not be more expensive. It would be way
mm.
cheaper.
Okay.
So
So
Not
it's
not
seeing,
the
suggesting that's a
legal, it's
good.
more legally expensive, but not the actual act is not more expensive. Got
right,
I can
right.
say as somebody who lived in Germany, do not recommend the first or the cheaper option there, or like there's a
it.
long history of that being a really bad scenario. So be careful what, yeah, money is not everything. Yes, exactly. But
Interesting. Would you expect, making people aware of this fact, let's say the expensiveness of execution, would that be another variable that could push people one way or the other? Say, if I think resources are really scarce, I might as well get rid of this person because they're another mouth to feed, and there's not enough stuff to go around. But if you tell me that actually executing him is going to be even more expensive than putting him in prison, then maybe that'll push me in the other way. Would you make that prediction?
We actually tested that.
mm,
Oh, okay.
We measured how expensive people thought
Hmm.
one was relative to the other, and that did not actually push around their
Hmm.
death penalty decisions.
Interesting.
so
That
even if you tell people it's cheaper to keep them alive when they detect scarcity, they still say kill them.
yes,
Mm.
Hmm.
So to
Interesting.
what is why is that? What do you think? Is it just sort of like the system is just sort of doesn't believe that explicit information or
I think it's because the mind doesn't actually care that much
mm,
about the reality
yeah.
of the cost of doing it.
Mm,
That when resources are scarce, even if you tell me that it's less expensive,
yeah.
the mind is still going to want
It's just so
the
counterintuitive.
solution.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think
Well,
it's a counterintuitive idea at the end of the day. Like you might tell me, yeah, I might explicitly say, yeah, okay, I believe that it's more expensive, but intuitively it doesn't seem like that's right. And that might be what's shaping people's attitudes.
I wonder, could it be, and Keelah, I'm sure you've thought of this, and maybe I'm just sort of slow to catch up, but like, could it also be sort of a folk or like a smart folk version of sort of deterrence? So, sort of, if we're in a very difficult, scarce world, then if somebody is like doing something bad, it's a higher cost, right? So, sort of like, I really want to like
Mm.
slap down bad behavior. Like this is no joke, kids. Like you can't do bad stuff, right? Like that's the
Mhm.
mode you're in. And
Mm.
so it's this flipping into like punitive mode when costs are high for just doing the wrong thing, right? And that would be a different thing. And that would even be if that was the causal structure for why that would be, it would even be rational, quote unquote, to even ignore the cost of that one murder in the sense of if people believe the
Mm.
death penalty is more deterrent, even if the people aren't consciously thinking this, then it's still rational because you're deterring more other people from doing the wrong thing in a highly scarce environment. That might be wrong, but that would be, I don't know. I'm sure you've thought of that. Like, what do you think about that?
Well, one thing that's interesting is that we've found that resource scarcity doesn't make people more punitive in general, that it
Oh,
doesn't just
interesting.
heighten their
Oh,
desire to punish and punish
mm,
harshly, that
mm.
it's specific to the use of capital punishment.
Wow, that's
Mm.
cool. That's amazing. That's such beautiful data. Yeah, and yeah, we're real time going through you're correcting us. This is wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was an interesting hypothesis, but yeah, that data speaks against that
Yeah.
hypothesis.
Yeah.
Uh,
Interesting. There's also this thing, I mean, like there's this trope, and I think believe it's true. Like, like for the example, like, I watched a YouTube video of like a Northern European prison, which, depicted the prisoner getting up in the morning and like, leaving his apartment and going to work, and coming home in the day, and that's a very different kind of, and this is like for a pretty serious crime, and so that's an example of sort of like there's a very big social safety net. People feel taken care of in like Northern European social democracies, and that seems to correlate with sort of non-punitive sort of retraining or minimizing recidivism sort of policies versus the trope of sort of in the somewhere like certain places in the US where it's sort of like oh, you shoplifted 3 times, we're gonna have to kill you, I'm sorry, like is that a caricature, or is that sort of borne out in the data? Like, am I reading into that with anecdotes, or is that sort of what you're saying? That like somewhere, so for example, like you could actually would it be that, if you had somewhere, for example, you took somewhere with really bad social safety notes, healthcare is expensive, it's not available, people's kids are hungry, food is expensive, and you just shifted to a Northern European model where food is
Mhm.
cheap, healthcare is free and universal, childcare is free and universal, people feel taken care of, that would immediately change sort of how people feel about prisoners. Is that sort of what this is saying?
That's interesting. I can speak from the data that we have that
Mm,
when we were looking at the global data, that we were using the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index as our proxy for resource availability. And that does incorporate a number of the things that you're talking about, like um, education, in addition to just resources
mm,
themselves. And we found that places that have lower human development were more likely to have the death penalty as a form of punishment.
mm. So
interesting.
I want to dig. So my hypothesis here is that it's not so much about resources at an absolute level, because if you think about it, in the modern world, our absolute access to resources is probably significantly higher than it would have been in ancestral environments. What it's indexing is not so much, whether there's a lot of stuff or not a lot of stuff, but the zero sumness of the
Mm,
stuff available. So if we live in a world that's more positive sum, where you know, maybe there aren't that many resources in an absolute sense, but eliminating you is not going to increase the amount of resources available to me because it's just about positive sum cooperation, and maybe having more people will increase the amount of cooperation and
mm,
increase the pie for everyone, and so it doesn't really make sense to try to eliminate someone. But if we are in a state where there are limited resources and where there is zero sum competition over them, then in that case, eliminating you is going to be a pretty appealing prospect because it's going to directly increase the amount of resources available to me.
mm,
So of course I would expect, zero sumness and absolute resource levels to probably be correlated, but they're still distinguishable
Mhm.
and they're not the same thing. And so I would expect, this Human Development Index, poor countries tend to be countries with crappier institutions, with more zero-sum competition and corruption. In politicians, where the society is much more about fighting over the slices of the pie than it is about growing the pie, and which you tend to find in wealthier countries. And so in those more zero-sum contexts where there's competition over power, and resources it's less about cooperation and growing the pie and more about just forming coalitions and grabbing what little of the pie is left. That in those contexts, there's more of a zero-sum mentality, and maybe that is what's driving this result rather than absolute levels of wealth.
Mhm. No, I think that's really insightful.
Mhm.
It reminds me a little of the fact that we saw differences across states based on state per capita income and whether or not they were likely to have the death penalty, even controlling for the political ideology of the state. So I totally agree with you that I think it's about a relative comparison, not about the
Mhm.
absolute number of resources. Can I add
Hmm.
another layer of complexity to
Sure.
this?
No,
Um,
I'm kidding. Yeah, please do.
so Ashley and I also thought that the value of the offender would matter in this calculation. So when resources are scarce, so even if resources are scarce, you're not going to get rid of the most valuable group member, no matter what
Mm.
they do. So we set up some experiments where we tested this, where we manipulated the value of the group member by making the offender either a very good hunter or an artist or a schlub who was lazy and didn't contribute anything to the group, and then look to see how resource availability would affect people's willingness to punish, and found that when resources are scarce, people actually became much less willing to it was banishment in this case, to banish the hunter from the group.
Mm.
Interesting. I mean, I wonder, it seems like the logic you're laying out here with regard to capital punishment would also apply equally to immigration. So that's another case where you are, as opposed to eliminating a member of the group, you are welcoming in a new member of the group. And so in that case, the same logic should apply, where if there's a limited amount of stuff and we're letting another person into the group, that is going to reduce the amount of stuff available for me if we live in a zero-sum world. And so have you thought about maybe extending this logic to immigration attitudes?
I haven't, but I love that idea. I think that makes total sense.
Hmm,
And
cool.
there is research out there. I think Carrie Pick is one person who's been working on this, looking at
Mm.
the different kinds of threats that different immigrant groups are seen to pose,
Hmm.
and the finds that Mexican Americans are seen to pose a more economic threat. And
Hmm.
so I wonder if maybe it also would be affected by whether or not the immigrants are seen as posing an economic threat versus a safety threat versus some other type of threat or benefit.
Mm. That's
Yeah,
great.
no.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm
Yeah.
aware of there's some interesting data, I think a political scientist by the name of Hans Mueller, basically showing that when you specify the characteristics of the immigrants, whether what country they're from, whether they're religious or not, whether they're highly educated or highly skilled or not, you tend to actually eliminate most partisan differences. In immigration attitudes. So if it's specified that this is a highly skilled, highly educated person who's coming in to immigrate, you don't really see partisan differences. Democrats, Republicans are happy to let that person in, which I think speaks to this hypothesis
Mhm.
that is really about options of zero-sumness and association value. You only really get partisan differences when it comes to Latin American immigrants and Muslim immigrants. And why that is the case is an interesting question. With the case of Muslim immigrants, I would expect religiosity to play a role there, and I would expect people who are more devout to be more threatened by a religious rival, perhaps. With Latin Americans, I'm not sure. It may have something to do with economic threat and the perception that maybe they're going to be competing with working class white people for low skilled labor. That could be a part of it, but it's an interesting
Yeah.
topic.
I mean, also
That
those
is.
two regions are also sort of like we have a very checkered history of like, the global north sort of dominating Muslim countries or global south countries. And so, I mean, I think like a very rational reaction is like these are people coming from more desperate circumstances, all else equal, right? Which
Yeah.
is fairly accurate, all else equal. Yeah.
Mhm.
Sorry, Keelah, you were going to say something.
No, I was saying that's really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, this also speaks to like, this also predicts, for example, that like association value and high resources should go together in like rhetoric about like outgroups, which I think is borne out too. Like this is this idea, like David, you were talking about, like the kind of resources based on what Keelah's saying, that like, you know, if I want to sort of like say that we should really be upset if I'm like a speaker, you know, like a demagogue or something, I should be like, look, there's these low association value people who who are taking resources or have resources that belong to you. Like that's the sort of like the deep structure of like a demagogue in a way. And I think
Mhm.
that's pretty borne
Yeah.
out,
Yeah.
you know, historically, right? Like, you know, again, I'm thinking, you know, just because of Germany, but like, you know, the idea that sort of like, you know, the Slavs have our, uh, or have our like, you know, space, you know, for the Third Reich, you know, so sort of like these people who are subhuman are occupying this wonderful land and area that belongs rightly to us. And you just fill in the blank of other examples. So I think this idea is sort of a lovely example of sort of like the deep structure of like this political rhetoric.
Yeah. Speaking of resources and their availability or lack thereof, I know you've done some interesting research on stereotypes and how they
Mhm.
relate to perceptions of resource scarcity and resource availability. So I'm curious if you could elaborate on some of that work because I think it's really interesting.
Thank you. Yes. So uh, I have done some work. This was with Oliver Sung and Steve Newberg.
Mhm.
And we were interested in this idea of ecology stereotypes
Mhm.
about whether or not um, people hold beliefs based on inferences of the kinds of environments that others come from, and specifically how that might be related to race stereotypes in the US. So I wonder if I should start from the beginning in terms of the theory behind this, or just talk about.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, it's incredibly, I'm so glad David brought it up. It's such incredible work. So yeah, and I'm sure many people don't know about it who are listening. So yeah, please just start from wherever you
Mhm.
think.
Yeah.
So the starting point is that the kinds of environments that people grow up in does actually affect their behavior. That when people grow up in environments that are resource poor and unpredictable, that this tends to engage more present focused strategies. So more impulsivity, more opportunism, more sexual promiscuity, less investment in education, and less investment in children. Whereas people who grow up in more resource rich and predictable environments do sort of see opposites. So being less impulsive, more planning for the future, more future oriented, more sexually restricted, et cetera, et cetera. So that work is already out there. Lots of people have quite a bit of robust research on that. And so we were coming again from the affordance management perspective of the mind interested in seeking out these threats and opportunities, that people should be attuned to this ecology information. If it provides really useful information about how others are likely to think and behave, then it would make sense for us to have stereotypes that are based on ecology. And so the first study that we did in our first ecology stereotypes paper was just exploring generally if people do possess these ecology stereotypes, as we called them. So we gave participants vignettes that described a person who was either from an environment that was really resource poor and unpredictable or resource rich and predictable. And we asked them, how likely is this person to be impulsive, be invested in their education, be sexually promiscuous, et cetera. And we found that people do have these ecology stereotypes, that they stereotyped people from more harsh ecologies as being more present focused, and people from these more hopeful ecologies as being more future focused. So that was our first, just establishing the basic effect. Then we did some additional studies that were trying to sort of rule out alternative explanations. We showed that people have these ecology stereotypes for environments that are seen both as being primarily white inhabited and primarily Black inhabited. We showed that these stereotypes are not derivatives of wealth stereotypes, that within high and low wealth, we still see these ecology stereotypes occurring. And then we also showed that it's not just a positivity bias towards people in hopeful ecologies, that the stereotypes are really specific to these present versus future focused in psychological suites of behavior. And so then our final study in that project was looking at if maybe that these ecology stereotypes could help to explain race stereotypes in the US. And the reason why we thought that that might be the case is because in America, race and ecology are confounded in the sense that Black Americans are more likely to live in resource poor and unpredictable environments, and white Americans are more likely to live in resource rich and predictable environments. And so if there is this confound, then it would make sense for the mind to be using race as a proxy for ecology. So we essentially separated race and ecology information in that last study. And we first replicated our finding that when you give people just ecology information, you see that those from harsh ecologies are stereotyped as more present focused than those from hopeful ecologies. Then we looked at just race information. So if we asked people to imagine a Black individual or a white individual, people were stereotyping the Black individual to be more present focused than the white individual. But when you provide people with both race and ecology information, that's when the really interesting results happened, that people's stereotypes tracked ecology and not race. So it essentially wiped out the effect of the race stereotypes. So Black Americans from hopeful ecologies were stereotyped as being just as future focused as white Americans from hopeful ecologies. And similarly, Black Americans from harsh environments were stereotyped as just as present oriented as white Americans from harsh ecologies. So those were really exciting findings for us.
Mm. Yeah, that's really amazing. I mean, in the sense of, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but I mean, the literature and also I think just sort of common knowledge was sort of that this is all about race. Is that fair?
Yes.
Yeah, and so
Yeah,
this
yeah.
would, yeah.
I mean, it's again, viewing humans as idiots, basically. We're just, blindly, we just don't like people who look different than us, and that explains this. And we have these crude stereotypes that aren't really tracking anything in reality, and we're just dumb bigots. And while a lot of the downstream outcomes of these stereotypes might be deplorable, the underlying logic to the mind that is creating these stereotypes there's something rational about it, that it's connecting to something deep about the connection between human ecology and human behavior, and people are picking up on this regularity, and it's not just a blind, crude thing. It's stemming from something real, which I think is really interesting, and it echoes some of Dave's work. It basically, the paper Can Race Be Erased? And if you find that, race is confounded with all sorts of things. It's confounded with ecology, as you mentioned. It's also confounded with coalition. And
Yeah.
when you deconfound those things, you can erase race effects. With Dave's work, if you deconfound um, skin color with whose side of a group conflict you're on, that can decrease or in some cases eliminate racial categorization. In your case, if you deconfound race with ecology, that can eliminate differences in racial stereotypes. So I think it's a really interesting line of work that delves deeper into the nuts and bolts of this important part of modern culture, and really I don't know, giving a lot of insight into it.
And the underlying evolutionary logic here, that I'll just toss out maybe for listeners who aren't familiar with it, is that humans across evolutionary history would not have encountered people of different races
Yeah.
very often, if at all. And so we wouldn't have expected evolved mechanisms that would encode race as a social category.
Right. And
Yeah.
I think to me, it's a lovely example of, and I think everything we've talked about, like juror decision making, legal decision making, racial categorization, it's the idea that beneath the surface, there's sort of a hidden logic that if you understand it, you can better understand what's happening and possibly change it, right? So, like you're talking about legal decisions that are happening right now as we speak, like people are literally deciding if somebody's guilty or not as we speak. And it's for reasons that maybe aren't good, like because somebody just seems gross to them. And that's completely irrelevant and bad that they're doing that. And so I think what I like about all this work is that it shows that there's sort of a hidden logic that if you unpack it, you can sort of get at the machinery in a way that we can then better evaluate. Like, does this make sense? Yes or no, which is a different issue, but still, yeah. So I like that that's sort of a through line of all that work.
Yeah, people have used the phrase deep rationality,
Mm.
and I think it's a good one.
Yeah. Have you thought at all? Because I like we're both here, and people ask me all the time, like, what do you think about the relationship between the coalitional work and the ecology work? And maybe we can also just pin that for another time, or you and I can talk about. Like, I'm not sure what I think about it, and I'm curious if you've thought about that relationship in the sense that we both have done this work showing that race is being used as a proxy for some other deep rationality thing. But what have you thought about sort of what's up with the relationship between ecology and coalition?
I have not put a lot of thought towards it other
Yeah,
than um, I've also seen that there is likely a connection there, and
yeah,
that it's interesting that
yeah,
race is being used as a proxy for both of those things.
yeah.
But I haven't, no,
Okay,
I would like
yeah.
to talk more at some point
Yeah,
about
maybe we
it.
can have that another time or something. Yeah, it's a good example of sort of like, yeah, me too. I've thought about that, but I've meta thought about it. I've thought about it abstractly, but not actually gone through it. So, yeah,
Yeah.
So
No,
oh, go ahead.
go ahead.
No, you.
No, I've been trying to understand, political alliance structures and why, the so-called white working class has recently gravitated a lot toward the Republican Party, which is sort of a recent phenomenon in American history. Um, and I'm trying to wrap my head around that and why we see a lot of this anti-immigrant sentiment um, and racially coded policy preferences coming from the white working class. Depending on how you want to measure it, you tend to see these effects. And just thinking out loud, I mean, these are people, if you think of the white working class and African Americans, they're coming from kind of similar ecologies. And I'm wondering if there's something about being in a similar ecology, evokes a kind of competitiveness. Like, we talked with Ann Pizor about how it's not so much um, the how far apart two groups are that will elicit antagonism. It's often the groups that are more similar to each other in terms of their status or formidability where you see the most conflict. And I'm wondering if something like that could explain this political realignment where you see the white working class developing these sort of ethnic resentments that steer them toward the Republican Party and toward these more populist policies. So I'm just thinking out loud here and spitballing, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
That's really interesting. It also reminded me, as another example, backs up what you're saying. You see that with intersexual aggression too, that
Hmm.
women tend to be most competitive with women who are similarly attractive, right? They're
Mm,
Yeah.
not being competitive with the super hotties or the uggos.
Mm,
It's
yeah.
technical terms. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
But it reminds me of the Saturday Night Live sketch that was Black Jeopardy. I don't know if you saw that, but they had Tom Hanks on it, who was a MAGA supporter, along with two um, other Black contestants, and the whole shtick was that the contestants were all agreeing on things, and how surprising was it that there was such agreement.
Mm,
And I think it's because of this shared ecology that it really does drive similar cognition and behavior.
Mm.
yeah. Interesting. Cool.
I was
Well,
also just, oh,
yeah, go ahead.
all right. I was also just going to say that we very recently published a paper that shows that ecology stereotypes are quite universal.
Mm,
So you see them existing in many, many countries around the world,
mm,
and uh, it's not always confounded with race. Um,
mm.
so, for example, in Japan, it's very homogenous, racially homogenous. And so
Yeah.
you wouldn't expect ecology by race effects, but we do see effects of other categories that have been confounded with ecology, specifically family structure. So
Mm,
there you see that single parent households get stereotyped like harsh ecologies, people from harsh
Mm,
ecologies.
mm. Is the idea that predicting people's impulsivity is really important, and so you're picking up cues that would predict that, and so that's why we're having this. So in that context, maybe people, you said which country was it? I'm sorry, was it
Japan.
Japan? It was Japan. Okay, I thought it was. So in Japan, if I live in Japan, I might just really experience that, boy, the family composition of people just really pops out to me. um, the idea would be, though, that the reason why that is happening is there's this underlying, probably non-conscious process that I'm trying to infer what somebody's going to be like, quote unquote, and I may not even be aware of it. Is that sort of a fair thing?
Absolutely.
Interesting. Yeah. So yeah, because I think most people, I mean, even when I heard this work, I mean, I was skeptical of the coalition work. I was skeptical of the ecology work. And in part, it's because it doesn't jive with my intuition, right? As you said, like a lot of law is based on intuition. And we know as psychology, like one of our things is that intuition is valuable because it is sort of a readout of our software, but it's not the description of the software. And so like I experience, race, I experience like these pop out effects of certain things, but why I do, or even why I'm attending to it might be hidden. And I think this is a lovely example of like, I don't think anybody listening would think like, oh yeah, no, ecology is something I'm tracking, or like I'm trying to figure out how impulsive somebody is. I mean, maybe like, occasionally we go, oh, that person seems really impulsive, but like it's not a category that is sort of intuitive. But in the same way, like your visual system calculates like how far apart the images are in each eye, and that's part of how you experience depth. Like we experience depth, but we don't experience like how that's actually working. I think it's a similar thing where there's all these sort of like social illusions, but the underlying logic is different. And I just love, like, I think the ecology work is so important as an example of that. Yeah, so yeah,
Thank
so I
you.
don't know if I have a question, but yeah, I just want to say, I mean, do you think about how have people responded to the work? Like, have you gotten much feedback one way or the other? I know it runs counter to a lot of existing theory that had been sort of very much in this sort of like it's about race or it's about ideology, that doesn't look at this underlying deep logic. Like, what's the response been?
So generally the response has been really positive,
Mm,
but I'll focus on the two less positive responses that I've gotten. One has been, are you saying that Black people are impulsive?
mm,
Are you claiming that there's a kernel of truth to the stereotype? And I I am surprised by that criticism because actually the work is saying quite the opposite. It's
mm,
saying that there's nothing about Blackness that makes people impulsive, that you
right,
can put a white person in the same ecology and expect it to elicit the same behavior.
right,
So actually it's very anti-essentialist.
right.
Um, and then the other critique that we've gotten is, well, are you just talking about social class? Is this really just social class stereotypes or wealth stereotypes? And we tried to get at that with that study that manipulated wealth orthogonally to ecology. But I find the social class question to be a really amusing one because um, social class theorists don't come from the same perspective at all. And they they would I think, be quite unwilling to say that their theory applies, for example, across species,
Mm,
whereas we are claiming that you do see across species these ecology effects. And so would you call, this is one question that we've had for social class theorists is, would you say that an elephant is a higher class animal than a rat? Um, and I don't think that they would be willing to make those claims.
right.
So,
Yeah,
Interesting.
it's a good question. Um, there's
Intuitively,
also,
yes, I could see an elephant wearing
I
a
don't
top hat and a rat
exactly. Yes,
scurrying in the
great chain of
gutter.
being. Exactly. That's the study there.
Yeah.
There's also a version of the social class thing that is the theory, right? Like, I mean, I actually wonder how much people, like, when they say social class, are they actually talking about ecology, right? Like, I actually,
Yeah.
like, that's also the other way to talk about it is that actually, in the same way that race is sort of a proxy for this underlying thing, I think when people are actually talking about social class, often they're talking, you're right, not about like absolute amounts, but it's about, these other things, which there in some sense is the right thing to be looking at, right?
Yeah, it's almost
mhm,
like what you're doing is you're providing a theory of what social class is,
Right.
right? As opposed to offering, saying, it's a different theory than this. It's like, yeah, social class obviously matters, and we have class-based stereotypes and class-based hierarchies, but you're providing insight into what that actually means, in a really interesting way.
And in a non-essentialized way. It's sort of
Yeah.
saying here's the like causal structure in the world, and
Yeah.
here's the Q structure, and it has nothing to do. It's a complete arbitrary thing. Like you could set up a scenario where like any attribute becomes correlated with this, or any feature of the world becomes predictive of it, and you would predict this is what people would latch onto. So it's
mhm,
not only causal, but it's exactly as you said, like not, it's getting rid of all the essentialism that has nothing to do with skin color, has nothing to do with the way people talk. It has nothing to do with any like X, Y, or Z attributes. Whether it's a species, an elephant or a rat, it's just these anything that correlates with this deep structure. Yeah.
I'm wondering, I mean, now my mind is racing with thoughts about, conspicuous consumption and signaling of class membership
It was
and
the
how
elephant in
people.
the top hat. It was the
Yes,
elephant in the
that
top hat.
that's what that's what.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, presumably we have all sorts of social signals, ways of communicating, our class membership, signaling that we're a member of the upper class, we're not a member of the lower class, and we, from the way we dress, the way we talk, the books we read, the furniture we have, our opinions, presumably in significant part function to signal our class membership. And I wonder if you could connect this work to that, where, the things that are effective class signals
Mm.
are things that are signaling, aspects of these ecology stereotypes like impulsiveness or present orientedness or whatever. Like if I can sit through a long, boring book, from the 17th century, that's going to convey, that I have a low present orientedness, and therefore that's a cue of, upper class culture. And that might be a common thread to a lot of, so-called highbrow culture. That the
Mm.
common thread there is that it takes a lot of, self-control and future orientedness to master the refinery of the highbrow culture. I could see lots of interesting directions coming out of this analysis.
Oh, 100%. We have long been interested in trying to figure out what are the cues that people are using to infer ecology.
Hmm.
I think that's a very interesting question.
Yeah. There's also the problem of like kids are really impulsive. So there would have to be like a correction on this system too for sort of like accounting for the fact that they're kids, but then like within that sort of tracking, because I think there's also a lot of rhetoric of like there's the outgroups kids too, right? Like so I wonder like the intersection of like perception of kids and kids being impulsive is like another interesting wrinkle in all this.
Mhm. Yeah, Steve Newberg would say that there aren't just independent sex stereotypes, age stereotypes, ecology
Mm,
stereotypes, that they're actually sex age ecology stereotypes. Um,
right.
Hmm.
Super interesting. Yeah. So much more to talk about. Um, we are quickly running to the end of our session here. We usually have a question, which is there something we should have asked you?
I don't think so. I think we covered all of the topics I was hoping to touch on.
Mm.
Um, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. No.
What was your motive in asking that question, Dave? I wonder if that should
Yeah,
affect
exactly.
our.
I wanted Keelah to talk about the art, the lovely artwork in the background or something. I don't. Um, I
Sure, they're
mean,
class signals of various kinds.
and the furniture behind David and my
Yes, of
books. We
course.
all have, yes, I am always like people have books in their background and I have books in my background. It's so silly. But Keelah, is there anything that if people are interested in sort of the intersection of evolution and the law, like can you point them either to you or like what would if there's like a student or just like some person out in the world who's sort of interested in evolutionary approaches to the law, what would you sort of point them towards as sort of inroads into that? Or obviously your own work, is there a certain work of yours that they should start reading, or what would you point them towards?
Oh, great question. I would say that I had the distinct pleasure and honor of co-organizing a special issue in Evolution and Human Behavior on evolution and law. And
Mm,
so that is a great collection from some fantastic people, all thinking about legal questions or justice related questions from an evolutionary perspective. So I think that would be a great place to start. I really like the paper that I contributed to that special issue. It was an ecology stereotypes paper, but it was looking specifically at stereotypes of criminality. So
mm,
who we think commits different kinds of crime. And it turns out that race-based criminality stereotypes are actually ecology-based criminality stereotypes.
mm.
So that I think is cool work that I would like people to be aware of. I would also say shout out to Carlton Patrick. I don't know if you've had him on to
No, we haven't.
interview already. No, not yet.
Mm-mm.
Well, he is an evolutionary psychology and law person. He's also funnier and better looking than I am. So he'd be a great guest to have to chat with. And his work is really, really cool. So I would point people in his direction as well.
Fantastic. That's great. Thank you. That's great. We'll have to have Carlton on, and Carlton should Venmo you or something after that. Yeah. Yeah, this is wonderful. David, do you have anything, any last minute questions to help you with your life of crime?
Um, well, I think I hereby declare this episode guilty of being interesting and fun.
Sustained.
Oh,
All right.
nice. Fantastic. So, on that note, what does the foreman do? Do they, it's like the members of the jury are adjourned? What is that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
this
court
case,
adjourned.
yeah, the court adjourns.
Okay.
Thank you so much for
Evolutionary.
your time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate getting the chance to speak with you both.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. I love this work, and Keelah, you're just one of the people when I think of like who's the usual suspects doing fantastic cutting edge experimental psychological work in just evolutionary psychology. Like you are one of the people I always think of, and so thank you for coming on and being and representing the work that's being done. I think it's really important, and it's super important given that there are literally like life and death consequences to all this stuff. So thank you for sharing it, and giving people a chance to listen to what you're doing.
Thanks so much.
Um, David, you are not only allowed to, but we would encourage you to support the podcast. It's not
Mhm.
against the law
No.
to not support the podcast, but it would still be nice if you did do that.
Yeah, it's not super erogatory, as the philosophers would say,
Oh,
but it is,
what does that
admirable.
what does that mean?
I think last I read, it was like something about how it's not like obligatory, but like it's still praiseworthy.
Oh,
Like donating
okay.
to charity, you're not like
Sure.
required to donate to charity. It's super erogatory if you do it.
Okay. It
Yeah.
sounds not, it sounds like something else, but that's great. It's a good
Yeah.
word of the day for you.
Yeah.
Subdoxastic is another one, which to my mind is just means it's not conscious and there's like complicated stuff going on.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Subpersonal beliefs, yeah, subdoxastic. So yeah, this philosopher's man. Anyway, please, if you're willing to tolerate the fancy words and you're enjoying the guests and the conversation and the topics that we're covering, we would encourage you to support the podcast. And David, how can people do that?
They can say a kind word about us on social media. They can leave us a kind review. They can visit our Patreon page. Any little thing you do helps, and it gives us the time and money to read more fancy books to learn fancy words like subdoxastic and supererogatory.
Awesome. Without further ado, here's the end of
Goodbye.
here's the goodbye.